Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up, right? We see in even zooming out from Job and looking at the biblical canon, we see how God acts consistently in just ways. So we can kind of frame a little bit of how God is going to act. However, as human beings, we still don't get to define how God is going to act. So, for instance, God is benevolent and loving. We were talking about this actually literally in one of my classes this week. God is benevolent and loving doesn't mean that God's rage is bad. So if God wanted to destroy the earth with a flood, is that unjust? Is it unjust? I mean, we could also say it's unjust to just let wickedness prevail. So flip it on its head. If God did not choose to destroy the earth with water, and he was saying that humanity is growing upon wickedness, upon wickedness, upon wickedness, we could also make we can make an indictment against God in our human sensibilities and say, God, you're so unjust because you said yourself that this place is wicked. You said I almost repent that I have made mankind, and then you do nothing about it. Yeah. You made us. You could destroy us.
Made us fertile.
Yeah, we're still producing wicked people in his eyes, right? Like in God's eyes, like we're not only being wicked, but then we're making other generations and allow them to perpetuate wickedness. And let's say if God hadn't destroyed the earth, is that unjust? Because the notion is, right? God knows that if civilization continues in this framework, evil will beget evil that will beget evil. And whatever God does in God's own economy, who are we as created beings to deem that just or unjust? So, yeah.
Well, we can certainly look at the flood and say that that was a form of justice.
Yeah.
You can say that God actually decided to make a fresh start. And there's a case to be made for that. But on the other hand, here we are a few thousand years downstream. Things don't seem to be much better.
Yeah. So is God unjust? We know what God can do. Right? Like it's not like God hasn't done it before. You know. So I think that's a good place to levy, right? What is our ideal of what is just? What are some things that God has shown to be just, right? Both in God's individual actions and in God's consistent character, right? So I could look to the text and say God clearly sees oppression as unjust. Because there's just enough throughout the canon of scripture to see how God moves towards oppression, how God hates oppression, what God does in response to oppression. Even if it's in the mind of an individual delayed, God still moves towards oppression. So, like Israel, for example, Israel's enslaved for 4 centuries. In my mind, knowing that I can't live to be 400 years old, that's too long, right? Like, I'm dead. If I'm in the first generation of those enslaved in Egypt, I'm dead by the time God wants to act. Likely, my children are dead by the time God wants to act. And also likely my great-grandchildren and possibly my great-great-grandchildren. So I have 4 generations of people who lived under oppression, and then God hears the cries of Israel and frees them after 4 centuries. Put it in perspective, almost mirroring the American narrative. Black slaves were enslaved for hundreds of years. Were freed in 1865, roughly, because the Emancipation Proclamation has in 1862, doesn't reach till Galveston, Texas, till 1865. So there were people that did not know they were free for 3 years until it reached Texas.
There's still slavery in the world.
There's still slavery in the world, right? Legalized slavery.
And there was sharecropping, which was
Yeah.
arguably a form of slavery, not
Yeah.
by precise definition. for
Even in,
years.
even in the Emancipation Proclamation, there's an exception clause, 13th Amendment, which says that for crimes of punishment, you can essentially be enslaved. That's still in the Emancipation Proclamation. That's still an amendment. So a clause rather. So let's say if slavery was still happening, right? Is in this context, in the American context, legalized slavery. Look at the narratives of African Americans in relationship to God at that time. And by and large, they say God is a God of justice while enslaved, while in chains. So what do we do with this kind of notion of like living in the calamity like Job is, right? Job is living and abiding in the calamity right now and trying to reckon with this God supposedly is just, right? And there's this notion of justice. This legal language is brought in, and Job is playing off of that throughout these two chapters, right? He's literally playing against that and also playing in response to his friends. You know, we don't talk about the response, but if you read the guy keeps referencing the responses of his friends. So he's doing this play between what the friends have said as a response, Eliphaz, particularly in this one, and what Job's response is, right, in the midst of that. So anything else?
One of the problems that we've got as mortals is that if God is God of justice, if God is always just, then that must mean that God's definition of justice and God's time clock for justice is dramatically different from ours.
Yep, absolutely. Lots to unpack. So in chapters 9 and 10, appreciate you all sharing. We get back to Job. I mean, Job is still in this long engaged dialogue, right? Like, we don't have a concept of like how much time this is elapsing over, right? I know I've been in moments of grief before where I'm wrestling with God for months and maybe years. So what time elapse of this in this context right now, we're not quite sure yet, but Job is still in this deep, kind of almost annihilationist mindset that he delves into. He answers these things like he's answering these apologetics. Like verse 1, Job answers and said, "Truly I know that it is so, but how can a man be in the right before God? If one wished to contend with him, one could not answer him once in 1,000 times. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has hardened himself against him and succeeded? He who removes mountains and they know it not, when he overturns them in his anger, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble? Who commands the sun and it does not rise? Who seals up the stars? Who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea? Who made the bear and Orion and Pleiades in the chambers of the south? Who does great things beyond searching out and marvelous things beyond number? Behold, he passes by me and I see him not. He moves on and I do not perceive him. In other words, Job says, who can bring an indictment against God when God has made all things? God upholds the things by his own strength and then just passes by me like I'm nothing. So there's this complexity. Like Job is like, you have made everything in the world. You know my frame. And in this moment where you should recognize me, you act as if I don't exist. So here's the building of this. I mean, I feel tense just saying that, right? So you know my frame, you know the muscles and bone and ligaments in my body, and I'm in my deepest suffering, and you just pass by me like I don't exist. Job is levying some accusations against God in these two chapters, and then painting this plea at the same time. So chapters 9 and 10, like he talks about his suffering as if God has perverted justice, right? that God has somehow warped this thing that subconsciously Job believed to be a kind of quid pro quo type of level of justice. Even Job has really, in some ways, ascribed to that. Even though his friends have a little bit more of a stronger view, warped view of that, Job also has adopted that too. He sees a little bit of a meritocracy when it comes to God, that I have done such things or refrained from such things. I've done nothing. So therefore, God should be compassionate to me. God, why would God levy this against me? Now we hear this language. It's very clear that Job believes that God has levied this against him. Right? He was going through the internal turmoil in chapter 3, going into 6 and 7. Now we're in 9 and 10, and it's now becoming a little bit more clear, as we could imagine, when you're grieving. And if you're grieving because of an action that's been levied against you, you have someone to name it against. That's different, right? Than I have an illness. You know, not everyone who has an illness inherently indicts God for that illness for a number of reasons. But when you know systematically someone has levied an injustice against you, you steal my car, and I find out you stole my car, I have an individual to levy my accusations against. If you steal my car like it's happened to me before, and I never get to find out who the individual was, it was almost futile for me to try to figure out who I'm going to levy this injustice against. Because I had nothing to levy it against. I'm going to levy it against a tow truck company. They're doing me a good service by finding what remnants of my car are left. So I'm not levying it against them. Am I going to levy it against my insurance company? No, because my insurance company is some ways mending some of the injustice by providing, you know, the payout for the car. What I want to levy against is the person or thing that has sanctioned injustice. And that's what we see Job doing, right? Job is now levying the indictment against God. In some ways, I would say Job, even a little bit more gently than I think I would have if I felt permitted to do such. So Job is doing this with the recognition of God's sovereignty. He starts off with the chapter 9. I mean, how can a mortal be just before God? So he still has this recognition of his creatureliness and how his creatureliness is not fully righteous before a righteous God. He presumes that already. Any thoughts on that? What I loved about the guide, I don't love about the historical moment, but what I did love about the guide is this challenge towards like this trial, the language. They bring in the Holocaust as an element of this ability and ability to indict and in some ways put God on trial. Right? I mean, that's the historical time period of 6 million Jews being executed over a period of years. You could imagine.
And that's not the first time.
Yeah, right.
Well, we have a 6 million, but over against that, how do you weigh Gaza?
Yeah, because the number is not fully told, right? Yeah, so continually, right? There's currently genocide in the world happening as we speak. What do we do with that?
But what do we do with God who told Israel to annihilate AJ's student? Oh, yeah, you want to finish my?
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, you had the facts on the finishing my thought. I'm starting AJ's thought.
I worked with some people from the Middle East, from Muslim faith,
Yeah.
Christian faith, Jewish faith. And one of the things that they say is that if the Israelis had done what God told them to when he freed them from Egypt and sent them to currently the Holy Land, God told him actually to annihilate and commit genocide to all the peoples that lived in that area. Men, women, children, babies, and all, and they didn't. And their thinking is that is part of the reason we still have such turmoil there. And it's going to be that way until the end of time. But another thought that occurs to me with this is talking about justice. What is the justice of the cruelty and bad things that happen to babies? What did they ever do in the current life anyway to deserve what they get? There's, in my mind, I can't see it. Perhaps that's because I am incapable of understanding God's mind. But the other side of that, is that because it's to teach somebody a lesson? Is it to teach other people's lessons? Was someone killed as a martyr to build a movement, to get a movement going that was perhaps not moving as quickly as God wanted it to? But this particular book of the Bible really drives me down some dark holes. And you know, I start going around in a circle because I can't understand the justification of God getting into a pissing contest with some other heavenly creature called the Satan. And Job suffers the consequences of that. You know, I'll bet you my man is better than your man. And all of those people, all the children, there was what, 7 boys and 4 girls. So 11 people there, true, they were human, they were not perfect, they were not sinless. Took them out, all the servants out. What about all those animals, all the cattle and the sheep and all the other animals that were destroyed for a bet, basically? I bet you my man can withstand whatever you can throw at him, so give it your best, do what you can. God may not have done it directly, but he allowed it. It is certainly a challenge to the faith. And it does, well, it affects it affects the opinion of a loving, caring, forgiving God. There's nothing loving, caring, and forgiving in this that I can see. It's to prove the point.
I appreciate you saying that. And that's the tension. That it's a holy tension. So wrestling. Like, how does God hold all those things together? Like what do we do with that? And we can go down dark holes in the midst of that, because I don't think anyone would say, apart from wanting to sanction wickedness itself, that the death of a child is ever justified. Nobody wants to say that from their mouths, right? Like, I would never utter that. I would never go to a comfort, a sad family and say, well, God was just in taking your child. That seems like a very cruel jest, right? Like, and I think to what you're saying is like, one, how am I as created being to measure any form of justice, especially in a horrendous moment? The audacity of me to try to measure that out is hard. And the character of God is put on trial when God allows things or God permits things. This is the big shadow side question. Does God allow? Does God permit? Is it both? Right. That is a wrestling point. Right? It's very much so a
I
wrestling.
think to that question, we almost have to plead not enough information to tell.
I agree. not enough information to tell. It also shows too, I think, um, what's interesting in this story versus other acts of injustice that we can name, right? Well, I can name an individual who inflicted acts of injustice when I think about the Holocaust. I have images of individuals who inflicted injustices, but it still goes back to that same thing. Like God is still somehow superintending the world. So it doesn't get God off the hook because human beings beget violence against human beings. It doesn't get God off the hook. And to this story, it definitely doesn't get God off the hook because God is the central character of the narrative line, right? Like God didn't say, "Hey, go get Job's servants and have them go kill his kids." The story would be a lot different, wouldn't it? Where would Job be levying his hatred and anger and frustration? It might be towards God, but it actually likely would be also towards the said individuals who enacted that. And we don't have that in this narrative, right? To what you're saying. So this is a clear, like evidential sign that God can be heavily involved in what we perceive are unjust acts. And it's a complicated endeavor.
And here we are.
We are. So like we're doing the psychoanalysis of Job that Job doesn't get to do in time. And this is the complexity of the grief and the pain and the injustices. So even how we view injustice from far, even how we can name the injustices that are happening overseas, but we cannot live into the mind of the person who's experiencing the injustice. That whole element is even different, right? I don't know a Gazan child to tell me what are you experiencing as you look around and your home is gone, nothing is recognizable, maybe even your parents are gone. That kind of conversation towards a God is going to be very different than even if I want to have a conversation towards God about allowing that to happen. So we get the grace of stepping into the mind of Job in some ways as a human record of what could be internally happening when someone is inflicted with the injustice, holding the injustice, and then questioning a God who enacted the injustice. It's very clear, like God enacts the conversation, so therefore is involved. Job says in chapter 9 that Job believes that God, I think we already named, holds all the cards, right? If Job wants to beg for mercy, he knows ultimately that only mercy can come from God. That God is the only one who has the authority to relieve Job of such circumstances. Couple verses that lift this kind of contention. Verses 22 and 24. It is all one, therefore I say, Job says, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the eyes of its judges. If it is not he, who then is it? So wickedness prevails. Wickedness has occurred through individuals said, and through God alone. Well, then, like, who else can be blamed for such but God? For allowing the perpetration or for being the perpetrator. So to Job, that brings a sense of hopelessness. Again, we come back to that. That Job feels a hopelessness because it's like an unfair trial. It's going before the judge that committed the crime. It's like going before the mob boss who has all the cards in their hands, right? And has the people to hold you bound to. And so what do? What do you levy against God? That God, who is the ultimate judge, gets to choose what the verdict may be. So Job plays out that notion of this verdict piece. The other thing to lift up, I think, in this context is that we have a constant reminder that Job does not ignore his suffering. He doesn't run away from it. All throughout this process, suffering is right in front of his experience. That could say something about the human experience, that we have the option to try to run away from our suffering. I'm not the person to say that one can or cannot run away from the suffering, but certainly we can seek to avoid our own personal suffering or the suffering of others. Prime example, we can choose not to watch the news. Right? We could choose not to watch the news for a variety of reasons. But if all the news is suffering calamity, I would tell you personally, that is really hard to watch every single day. So I can make a choice, right, to say, I'm going to step away from this. Doesn't mean I don't care about suffering, but the reality of this inundation of the world in which we live in, that has its beauty, has its challenges, but also has so much suffering in it. And literally, news networks make a profit off of uplifting that suffering too, right? You know, and getting the most profound clip and the most profound interview. So that pushes us closer and closer to that. And a choice we can make, and sometimes I think we have to make for our own well-being, is to not watch it as much. But that's different than running away from it. Because the image is there, the notion's there, the knowledge is there. Even if I'm not sitting in front of the news regularly, right? We walk or drive throughout Durham, and you encounter injustice and suffering. I see a young woman right at Hillsborough almost every week, 3, 4 times a week, out there asking for money. She's unhoused. That's a form of suffering. Living in that instability every day is a form of suffering. And by far one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest country in the world. I could choose to avoid eye contact with this woman. Or I could choose to look at this woman whether I have something or not, and see within that woman, one, her full dignity, but also the plight of injustice. Right? It's uncomfortable to look at her, not because of her, but because what she is experiencing that I don't have full control to remove her from. So Job is a good example of, right? Like Job does not remove himself, doesn't insulate himself from the suffering. He looks himself constantly, right? He's doing a lot of introspective work, but also in dialogue with God. That's a thought for us to hold, right? When we think about how this biblical picture is going to be painted of what it looks like to have suffering before you, and what things that you might have to do to work through that. When you feel hopeless and you feel not advocated for too, right? So all these layers. Job doesn't feel he's advocated for by God. It's not that he's just suffering, but the person who holds the cards in the suffering is not advocating for his deliverance and his redemption. So we have those elements too, right? This is the mob boss who has put out a hit. And then we find out who the mob boss is. And the mob boss listens to us. The mob boss doesn't care, seems like in Job's eyes. I put out the hit. You're still alive. So what you worried about? Could you imagine someone saying that to you? Well, you still got 2 good legs. They might have sores on them, but you're still around. And there's this tension of God being present as also the inflictor. So Job says, basically, I'd rather you just leave me alone. Like, get out of my house. Right? Like, go somewhere else.
It's like sadistic, really.
Yeah. So, Job just wants to be left alone. Like, you brought this on me. And then, you're still here. I feel you. Like, I know you're present. And I want you to just leave me alone. couple more verses, and then we'll end. Are not the days of my life few? Hear Job in this, verses 20 through 22 of chapter 10. Are not the days of my life few? Let me alone, that I may find a little comfort. In other words, God, leave, please. I've been talking to you for I don't know how long, and you haven't changed anything, so why don't you just leave? Get out my house, taking my kids, taking my property, which means my wealth, right? You haven't corrected my wife, so she thinks I'm a fool. You let my friends come here and say that I must have done something horrendous, and God is pissed off at you and wants to get back at you. What have you done for me? And that you're here like you're consoling me. Go home. Leave me alone. Right? Common 21st century language. Get out my house. How'd you get in here anyways? Oh, because he owns the house. That's weird. It's like the landlord coming in and saying, hey, why are all these pipes busted? Because you burst the pipes. And now you're blaming me. And you're not fixing them. And my house is flooding. Just get out my house. Just leave. Are not the days of my life few? Let me alone that I may find a little comfort. The one little comfort that I have is you being out of my sight. God, right? He's talking to God. Before I go, never to return to the land of gloom and deep darkness, the land of gloom and chaos. Comes back to this light and darkness language that he's been talking about, where light is like darkness. And Job literally believes that the absence of God is better than the presence of God at this point. And what a place to be where you think God's leaving is better than God being present with you. It says a lot about what you're feeling and what darkness you're in. Because most people of faith say, like, if I don't have anything else, I want God to be present. Job is an example. If I could have anything else, I want God to leave. I'm innocent. I've done no wrong. I'm trying to repair this relationship by telling you what's wrong. And you won't repair the relationship. Like, think about it from the context to what I mentioned earlier. Right? In the hands of an abuser, the abuser has to rectify to the extent possible what they have inflicted. And so to be in proximity and to live in relationship with the abuser healthily means that the abuse must stop. So if you're still laying your hands on me, how are we in right relationship? To what Job is saying, God is still laying his hands on Job, but somehow is loving, and somehow is caring. So what kind of justice comes for that? Job is living like what? Like if I make a case against you, I'll never win. And I have no hope in confronting you because you haven't said anything yet. Right? So we're still, I know there's some stuff to come, but he hasn't said anything yet. Where's God? God has not said anything. It's almost you can see Job standing in the middle of the street talking to himself. That's what it seems like. Like literally feels like a manic episode of Job just letting things up in the sky or wherever. Yeah, because no one's engaging with Job. Job is engaging with himself and living towards God. So he discloses a lot about himself in this piece. And the last piece that I'll say before we leave today is that we can tell in chapters 9 and 10 that this kind of suffering is an estrangement. Right? The more Job talks about God in relationship to himself, God in relationship to the calamity, God in relationship to his absence, is more that Job wishes to be estranged from God. So unanswered moments of suffering can lead to estrangement. And we see Job literally living and ending that in chapter 10 with this sense of like, I'm so deeply and darkened by this calamity that I feel strange, and I'd rather be estranged right now. So that's where we end, not on a happy note, but that's where that's where we end today on chapters 9 and 10. And so next week we'll continue to flow through. We'll skip over a few chapters, and we'll go into chapter 12. We'll do two chapters, chapters 12, 13, and 14. I'm sorry, three chapters rather. Chapters 12, 13, and 14. And Job is still speaking. So we're going into this speech process. We're not quite getting yet to the dialogue, a full dialogue with God. So that's where we'll be on next week. And of course, bring your thoughts and questions to that. I appreciate you all. I love doing this. I love engaging. So thank you all. Thank you, Zoom folks as well. And remember, you can engage at any time. So you just simply unmute. If you disrupt me like it's the voice of God, it's fitting for the book of Job. So go ahead and do that. And because I would love to hear you as well. But you all have a wonderful afternoon, those that are on Zoom, and I will see you on next Sunday.
Okay, this is Linda Daniel. Thank you. I want to make sure you know it's Linda. Thank you. I had enjoyed hearing you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Wonder why we can't see everybody who's there.
Well, I think Linda had her camera off.
Yeah, but her little box wasn't there either.
Mhm.
Oh, you didn't see it there? Oh, I think I know why.